in chapter 12, the covenant promise to Abraham, which is repeated in chapter 15, where God tells Abram that his descendants will be as many as the stars are in heaven. In chapter 17, where the covenant is sealed with the sign of circumcision, and that covenant then means that every male among you shall be circumcised. That's the sign of the covenant. That's the significance of circumcision for the Jewish people. On page 69, you can see the covenant is one of the three key themes that are found throughout the Deuteronomistic history. So this is the story that goes from Genesis right through to the end of Kings, and it's known together as the Deuteronomic history because it's believed that the Deuteronomist, the D redactor, kind of collated the material finally. Of course, the first theme, as we have seen in past weeks, is Torah, that is often translated as law. The law is the way in which the people of Israel show themselves to be part of the covenant. The covenant is also an important theme in Exodus, in Exodus 19 onwards. The covenant is made or renewed, or a different covenant is made with Moses on Sinai, so it's often called the Sinai covenant. This is where God reveals his name, I am who I am. And this is where the law is given to enable the people to show their commitment to God through the covenant in all sorts of ways in daily life. The third element in this section of the Deuteronomistic history that we're not going to be spending a lot of time on, but it does provide the context for looking at what we'll be focusing on, is the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was the place where God was believed to reside. So we saw last week that Exodus 25 to 30 sets out the plans for building the tabernacle. Exodus 36 to 40 show how the tabernacle was built. There's 10 chapters in Leviticus that describe the sacrifices that are to be made in the tabernacle. And Numbers tells about how the tabernacle is to be a mobile sanctuary. It is to move from place to place. And just to give you an idea of the detail, this is a reconstruction of the tabernacle taken from the biblical material. In case you're wondering about the size, all you American football fans, the top right-hand corner shows you the size relatively of an American football field, and I'm assuming that an Australian football field would be of similar size. So this was a big area, allegedly, according to Leviticus and Numbers, that Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers, that was set aside as the people were traveling for the holy place and for holy activities. So the Holy of Holies is number one. That's where God lives. The Ark of the Covenant is in front of that. Then there's the veil, the altar of incense, a lampstand, an outer veil, and then places, tables around in the outside where the priests would sacrifice the animals. Now, of course, as we saw last week, the Exodus story itself is a story rather than an historical narrative. And so we need also to have the same kind of approach to considering the logistics of the reality of the logistics of the sacrifices as these people allegedly moved around the wilderness. In other words, this is setting it up to say that Leviticus is a looking back from a much later period from the priests as to how the tabernacle and the sacrifices should have operated in the story. They couldn't really have operated like this in reality because there's a huge business going on there. But of course, the tabernacle is forms the template for the temple, and what happens in the temple, both before the exile, but particularly after the exile, is modelled on this. So you can see on page 70 the content of this section, from Exodus through Leviticus and Numbers on into Deuteronomy, and then Joshua, which is by that time when the people enter the land. So Leviticus is nominally, Leviticus is going to be the focus of what we're doing this morning. Leviticus is nominally set in the story at this time, but as I've indicated, it's a later creation of the priests that's pushed back into the story. So we're going to start with an exercise to focus on the theme, and it actually comes from a passage in Numbers, which you'll need to look up in your Bibles yourselves. And Elizabeth will put you into small groups. And we want to invite you to take those questions that are on page 71, read through Numbers 20, and talk with one another about what is the issue that's happening in this scene that's depicted. And verse 12 particularly mentions holiness. So how would you, in the light of this story, how would you define holiness, which is the focus for our session today? Okay, so those questions are on page 71, and you should be spirited off into small groups.
Can you take down there? Thank you. All right. There we are. Social scientific criticism is looking at how a particular book or text in scripture sits in its wider social and cultural setting. So it's looking at how you might interpret it with a full appreciation as far as you can with an ancient document of the society and the culture in which the text was first written. So the focus is on the context and that context in which the text came to be. So that's really important that we note this. There's been quite a few studies done about this, and I'm going to give you a quote to think about here. And it's a long quote, and it's in your book, but you're going to have to pay close attention to it. It has always been the basic assumption of humanistic literary pedagogy that the similarities between ourselves and others removed in place or period are so much more profound than are the surface differences separating us from that. Given the necessary scholarship and historical care, their imaginative products can be put at the service of our moral life. What does that mean?
That the qualities of human nature are the same or similar regardless of the time period that you're born in.
Is that what it's saying?
That's part of what it's saying.
And in essence,
that's an assumption.
That's right. Margaret's right. That's what we assume. Correct. Peter, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, I don't know if it's connected at all. In essence, we assume that their story is our story.
That's right.
Yeah, we do. And we assume that the things they are doing, we put our own lens on that and our own interpretation on that. How many of you really think, if I push you, when you think of these people, when you hear the Old Testament being read in church, how many of you have this unconscious bias that I'd like you to surface now, that they're really just like us with funny clothes? How many of you really think that? Especially when we dress kids up as shepherds and angels and nativity scenes and do all of one wise men. How many of you?
I think it's almost impossible not to. That's why we have to remind ourselves over and over that it's not. And I love the title of where this approach is coming from, Lionel Trilling's The Problems of Teaching Jane Austen to Columbia students in the 70s.
Yes, that's right.
Exactly what happens every time we read the Old Testament.
That's right. And we put, because we can't help it, put these things in place. When we imagine the temple, you probably imagine something that's a bit larger and dirtier with people in funny clothes, but you'll probably still got this mental thing of an altar at the front and people sort of standing or sitting behind it in lines.
Yeah.
And that's just what we do. So this is a great quote because it's to remind people that actually the differences are what is the most profound thing, not the similarities. You are not similar to the ancient Semitic people other than you are human.
Mm.
This was a vibrant Oriental culture with no running water, with no power, no cars, no houses as we understand them,
No police.
no police, sitting in a
No
desert,
doctors.
wild animals
right.
around. The education system was at home where you kept your animals in your tent or your house. This is a completely different culture, I venture to suggest, from what any of you have experienced.
Yeah.
And they weren't quiet in church in rows. They had drums, they had noisy instruments, they sang and they danced. Do you do that in church? Probably not.
I think we ought to.
What was that, Piers?
I said, I think we ought to. And in fact, I have danced in church.
Yes, I've had people who've danced in church, but it's not a usual thing. It's not the way we normally approach our worship. So, all right, so let us move on. So basically this means that the social scientific criticism of the Bible and its environment is trying to get us to think about what it's really like and compare and contrast biblical and modern culture and how that influences our interpretation of the Bible. So we're going to try and find ways that we can put to our use that try and get us to recognise that bias and put it to one side. So there's a number of things that the social scientific approach does. First, there's a concern to discover the social conditions of the faith community. So it means what are the social facts we know about the various times in the history of Israel? What is the reality of their life? How do we describe this framework of their life? So how do they organise themselves socially, for example? What is the world in which they move in and the faith community is in? So that's the first thing. Secondly, we want to look at this in a critical way. So the overall theoretical framework of this is historical critical framework. So we compare it to other cultures and we look at other extra biblical texts and we try and discover things about the general environment these people are in. The third thing is symbols and how they in their social organisation. So the text is a powerful symbolic thing. It has rituals and doctrines in the social organisation. It has symbols in that social organisation that become very important. And then we have the role of the community of faith. What is its significance to the rest of the community? How does it work itself out? How is the tradition of that faith community expressed? What stories does it tell about itself? All of these things are important. So just to sum that up, social conditions, what do we know of the social time of when the text was written? And what is the reality of everyday life for that community and how does it fit within the sphere of ancient social life? And what is the social world? How do we discover something of it? What is the text in the social world? How does the symbols and rituals and beliefs function in the text? How does language function in the text? And then lastly, the community of faith. What is its role in identifying and maintaining the faith of its members? How does it operate with its symbolic universe? What structures does it provide for people? And how are these people taught from generation to generation how this community is meant to function? So they're all the things that we're going to look at when we apply it to the text of Leviticus today. So just before we pop to Leviticus, we have an example from the book of Exodus. And you can see this is from chapter 19 here. And you could consider this particular quote here as a bit of a climax of the story of Exodus. It's the first one before we get to Mount Sinai. And from Mount Sinai, law-giving dominates the whole thing right up to Numbers 9. So in social scientific terms, this statement to Moses in Exodus 19 could be seen as the faith statement of ancient Israel. And that's because it sets the stage for exactly how Israel are going to do things. So you need to be obedient. You need to keep the covenant. If you keep the covenant, then you will be my treasured possession. The mountain itself at Sinai is symbolic of the tabernacle. It's a sacred place where only those authorized by God could enter. And when you read Exodus with that point of view, Mount Sinai has three zones. There's the summit, which corresponds to the ark or the inner sanctum or the Holy of Holies. And that's the place where only Moses can go to meet the Lord. The rest of the mountain corresponds to the holy place. So you've got the chosen few halfway up it, such as elder and priest. And then down the base, that's the outside part, you have the place that's open to ordinary people who can purify themselves, and they do in Exodus by washing their clothes, abstaining from sexual intercourse, and they can offer sacrifice there. So that's an example of applying this social scientific approach to a text. Now, as riveting as Exodus is, and we're going to put aside golden calves and aftermaths and all sorts of things, and we're going to turn ourselves to the food laws of Leviticus 11. Now, you've got a lot of them printed out in your book. You can find them there. I'll just check the page.
72.
Yes, 72. And we're going to work our way through them. And I asked people if they had a chance, if they could read through these texts. Have any of you read through them?
I read through 19 and 20 and 20, those few, and I was just amazed. I was amazed.
You were amazed, yeah.
Yeah.
Leviticus is a very interesting text. Don't think it's boring. I know you all think it's boring, but I hope you change your minds about that. Now, in Leviticus, we find all sorts of things. We find laws about temple worship. There's lots of laws about temple worship, festivals, and sexuality. We're going to concentrate on the dietary rules today, and we're going to see if we can make sense of them in the light of a social scientific criticism. And that is, we're going to look at how were clean and unclean foods decided, and what does those decisions tell us about these ancient people. And we're going to have a brainstorm now, and I might put you in small groups to do this. We're going to think about why some foods were clean and some were unclean. And I want you to make a list in your groups as to why you think that. Is there any order in this list? What is there any sense in it? Does it suggest a certain sort of society to you? Is it agrarian, nomadic? Does it have established rituals? What sort of society would have such laws? So I want you to think about, why are some foods clean and unclean? How did they come to this decision? Okay, we all understand our task?
Yep.
Excellent. Well then, how did you get on?
Interesting.
Why do we have food laws? Why are they there? Why do you think these ancient people have these distinctions?
To keep the population healthy.
Yes.
And
Keep them healthy.
And to maintain their identity as well.
Maintain their identity.
Yeah.
So they've got special food laws, so they maintain a separate identity from other people. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Health and hygiene. How much did they know about health and hygiene in 5 BCE, in the 5th century BCE?
If you ate the wrong foods, you died.
Yeah.
Did you? So how come some of these things that are eaten with impunity by other cultures make Israelites die?
That's right.
For instance, shellfish.
Yeah, and
Anyone
that's
die here from shellfish? No.
I suggested with shellfish that it was because they had to be brought from the coast, and people were hill people, and therefore by the time it got to them, they would be rotten anyway.
Okay.
That's possible.
But what
But the
about fish?
Babylonians ate it.
well, that's where I reckon they've come from. That this is separating these people from the Babylonians. So if the Babylonians do it, it's probably evil. If they do it, it makes them holy and separate.
Yep. So that separation is really important. it's probably not hygiene. We, with our modern thinking, think of food poisoning.
Yep.
And that's one of the modern lenses we whack right over these ancient cultures where that's probably not their concern. What else did you discover about this? What sort of people made this list?
The priests?
Possibly, but it's not so much who wrote it. What sort of people would have a list like this? Let me rephrase that. Are they nomadic? Are they established agrarian communities? Who are they?
No, they're nomadic.
They could be nomadic.
I
don't
think by the
seem to
time
have
this was
a-
written, they were not nomadic, though.
No, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Pastoral.
Pastoral people. Yes, I think that's probably a good description. What animals are clean? What did you notice about the
Yes.
clean animals?
Sheep
Right,
and cattle.
Yeah,
Sheep.
domesticated animals.
They're domestic
mostly.
animals. So what
Okay,
does that tell you about one of the category, one of the reasons we've got clean and unclean? What's clean? Your domestic animals. What's unclean? A lot of wild ones.
Mm.
But camels are also domestic. I mean, they are a beast of burden, though.
They're a beast of burden, and camels aren't included because they don't quite fit all the categories. Same as the horse. Not that Jewish people used horses, they didn't. So when you read that Palm Sunday thing that Jesus didn't pick a horse, he picked a humble donkey, chuck it out the door into the dustbin as the piece of nonsense it is because it's an irrelevancy. Jews didn't keep and ride horses.
Cute.
And if you don't believe me, look up horse in the Old Testament and get back to me and see who owns them. It's
Well, the
Egyptians
kings.
and Persians and Persian kings and Babylonian chariots. I don't think you'll even find the king of Israel on one.
Mm.
Anyway, I digress. Anything else that you noticed about this list?
Only
long.
that it was very easy to read it through the lens of modern thinking of hygiene.
Yes, it is. And every time I do ask this question of groups of people, that is their first answer, hygiene. And they say pigs were dirty. And I point out that every other culture ate pigs except the Jews. And
So-
they
so-
weren't dying in droves.
So the question we probably touched on is virtually with the Muslim faith, there's a very strong emphasis not eating pork.
That comes from the Jews. The Muslims will deny that categorically, but that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
Because the Muslims just hijack bits of the Old Testament into the Quran.
Mhm.
And remember that it's written 6 centuries into the Common Era. So it's a relatively modern faith by comparison with the Jewish faith.
Right.
Do the Jews still follow these things? I mean,
Yes.
they don't eat crustacean, they don't eat.
No,
Okay.
they certainly do. We talk about these laws being onerous and burdensome, and that's why Christianity came to save them. The Jews have managed to practice these laws probably now for something like 15 centuries. So, you know, take that into account.
So if you're in Israel, you don't have seafood much. I mean, other than
They
fish.
eat fish.
Yeah.
Fish are
What's the idea behind describing insects as 4-footed?
We'll get to this because
Oh,
they
good.
can't count. I keep telling you not to take notice of numbers in the Old Testament. Sometimes they mean something specific, but they rarely mean exactly what they are. So, yes. So, the big thing here is the set apart. What does holiness mean?
To be set apart.
To be set apart. So, that's the big thing here. And of course, Leviticus is known as what? What's its other name that it's often called?
Law.
Law.
It is law, but it's called something, the something code.
The holiness code.
Yes, it's called the holiness code. And that's because it's about what is up in front of you at the moment. So there are creatures you can eat, but these are detestable. Sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not eat any abhorrent thing. You are a holy people to the Lord your God. So holiness is the name of the game in the Levitical laws, and they're often referred to as the holiness code for that reason. And it's not because of hygiene and health. there is some things to do with domestic animals and animals of prey. Animals have to be killed in a certain way. They need to have the blood bled out of them because the blood belongs to God. That's considered the life force, because they did observe in the ancient world that if you bled a lot, you died. So that was fairly accurate observation. And what do animals of prey eat?
Dead things.
Other animals.
They can eat carrion. What else do they eat? They eat live things.
Oh, yeah,
Ah.
baby lambs.
Yeah, they eat mice and they eat rabbits and they eat other small animals, and they do not bleed them.
Ah.
So by virtue of what they eat, they're automatically unclean and animals of prey. So lions and bears, wolves, other sort of catty and doggy kind of things around, eagles and hawks, they're all birds and animals of prey, and they eat food that has not been bled. And they also eat carrion, a lot of them. So that makes them unclean. They're touching dead things and they're not bleeding things. So, and of course, your domestic animals are far more valuable to you than a gopher or a raccoon or whatever is out there in the desert. So you are going to see them as they're going to be labelled clean because they are depended on for meat, for fibre, for their skins, for their milk. So they're very, very valuable to you. So they're, of course, clean. And most of your domestic animals have cloven hooves and chew the cud. In fact, all of the ones you depend on have. So that's how that becomes a law. So each permitted food, just to digress slightly, as well as hygiene, through the centuries, people have spent time trying to work out if there's some other way of understanding why some are clean and unclean. And Philo, back in the 1st century, Philo was a very unusual Jewish philosopher, and he tried to convince his Greek friends that the Torah was philosophy. I think he failed spectacularly, but he would probably have a different opinion to that. And he points out that all the animals that are unclean represents gluttony. So pork, for instance, is representative of gluttony because it gives you indigestion. So Philo had a way of trying to explain to his Greek friends why this is all about an analogy. And other analogies have come up. For instance, mice and weasels, which are unclean foods, were considered by various popes to be symbolic of malicious tale bearing, for example. So you get all of these things through the ages of people trying to explain things. Reptiles that wriggle on their belly signifies people who are slaves to their greedy desires and their passions. And hoof and divided cud represents the division between good and evil. And the chewing of the cud is meditating on the law of God. And I would suggest you treat these things with some of the contempt they deserve, because as we're going to see, they're very modern interpretations of how to understand the food taboos and the laws. When was Leviticus written? I mean, this is actually an important point we need to consider. Who was it written for and why? It was written during the exile, so people who said Babylon were bang on the money. As we know, Cyrus of Persia permitted exiled Judeans to go back and rebuild their temple. It took around 25 years for them to do this. And of course, they needed their set of laws to go with that. So it's the scholarly consensus that the book of Leviticus was worked on over quite a number of decades by a number of different people. And it's probably a composite document that was finished sometime at the end of that rebuilding of the temple when they returned from exile, because a lot of stuff had been lost when the first temple was destroyed. So this context doesn't mean that the exiled priests made all these laws up, because there would have been oral traditions and there would have been some practices they had while in Babylon, probably the food laws being one of them, that they could use quite easily without a temple to still set themselves apart from the foreign people where they were living. So it's best to think of Leviticus as a rather complex document, written over an extended period of time, remembering the temple took 25 years to rebuild. by a number of authors who refined it over that time as temple practices were re-established and put in place. And it tells us what the priesthood, or at least the influential part of the priesthood, thought what a temple ritual should look like and what the laws that people would practice generally would look like. So this gives us the first thing of our social conditions. It's to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, and within that context, we need rituals. We need rituals for the temple, and we need the law for the people to follow at home. So the return to homeland from exile in Babylon, adhering to Cyrus's decrees, reconfirming the identity of Israel as a separate people is the context or the social conditions in which our texts are written. And to support this idea, you can have a look at where Leviticus sits in the Pentateuch. The law is couched between two narratives, and that gives the framework for interpreting the law, because of course it's sitting between Exodus and Numbers, which are the two books that tell the story of people coming out of Egypt, and they also contain some law in them, and Leviticus sits between them. So what is the theme of these laws? Would any of these laws be chosen arbitrarily? Now, we might do this in the big group rather than go back into the small group. What do you think is the giveaway theme of these set of laws? Are they chosen arbitrarily, or do you think there's a reason for them?
Could definitely be a reason for it. It could be
Yeah.
actually to, is it to set people aside to make sure that they stayed true?
Yeah, that's right. That's the main reason, I think. It's to set people aside. What other reasons could you think of? Now, remember, this is a community living in a fairly arid region. There's not a lot of fertile area. It's around the rivers. You're dependent on the rivers for water. There's no power. There's no cars. You walk everywhere. You are dependent on the elements completely because you have to grow your own food or you suffer famine. So what are the other things you think might be influencing these laws?
Actually, the weather could, you know.
Absolutely, the weather could. The seasons, whether it's rainy, whether it's drought,
Yes.
whether there's a plague of locusts. We know these were not uncommon in biblical times. These would come through as the plague of mice is doing currently in our own state and razing it all to the ground.
He also mightn't have wanted them wandering off after wild animals for food and things like that. Keep them compact.
Yes, you are much safer when you live in an area like this if you stay together. If you are all living separately a couple of miles apart, how easy it is for you to be attacked by an enemy.
To be picked off.
Picked off. How easy would you be fall prey to bears or lions? Much easier. If there's a big mob of people with a lot of animals, you are much safer, are you not?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So these are all the considerations we need to think about as we come into the holiness code. So we're going to move on to exactly what does holiness mean and what the Hebrew word is. So I'll get John to put the screen back up. Better. So our next thing is we look at is in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, we've got these, you are a people holy, you shall be holy. So holiness is, the Hebrew word is kedusha, and it carries with it separateness or distinctiveness. It was adherence to this code that made Israel a special people, a nation set apart from other nations. And Deuteronomy 14:1, which should be in your book on page 72, is an example of this distinctiveness. So if you have a look at Deuteronomy, you can see that it says you have to do a number of things. Do not lacerate yourselves or shave your forelocks for the dead. This is probably because the culture they're living in did those things. So you don't cut yourselves in mourning. You don't shave your hair off because you are holy. You shall not eat anything that dies of itself. That is, you don't eat carrion. So if your cow dies, you don't cook it up and have a banquet.
All right.
You can give it to your slaves and aliens, but you cannot, or you can sell it to a foreigner, but you can't eat it. So these are the things that we know are setting them, not only tell us why they're apart and how they're setting themselves apart, but it also tells us the practices of the people they're living among. So we learn that too. Okay. And this is Deuteronomy 28 on page 72 also. And if you do not, I love the Deuteronomic curses, they're so colourful. If you don't obey the Lord, and here we have this obedience again with these commands and decrees, this is some of the things that will happen to you. Cursed you shall be in the city, and cursed you shall be in the field. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, the increase of your cattle, and the issue of your flock. And then it just goes on to say lots of other things. The Lord will send upon you disaster, panic, frustration in everything you attempt to do until you are destroyed and perish quickly on account of the evil of your deeds because you have forsaken me, just in case you miss the point. And the Lord will make the rain of your land powder and dust, and from heaven it shall come down upon you until you are destroyed in case you miss the first threat.
That's a bit scary, isn't it?
It's entirely scary, and it's making a very strong point. If you do not follow this code, you are going to be in deep trouble. So this is part of the covenant. So you follow the law and you will be blessed. You don't follow the law of you will be cursed, and following the law is part of the covenant. And that is what makes you holy and God's possession and sets you apart from all the people. Does that all make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Excellent.
In other words, just do as you're told.
Pretty much.
It
This is
seems
why
to me it
rabbis-
puts the priests in an enormous strengthy position, because they can say, well, you got yourself into trouble, didn't you? Because you didn't obey the law.
It's not so much the priests that say that, it puts the prophets in a really strong position. They're the ones that spend a lot of time saying you have done the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it does put
I mean,
the priests in
it's
a
very
strong
clear.
position. It
if
is
nothing
very
else.
clear.
But it
It's
does. But
very
it does. I mean, I agree with Piers that that prophetic role is taken on by the priests, because Ezekiel 44 talks about the priests as the ones who make the decision about what is holy and what is unholy, what is clean and what is unclean.
Yeah.
So if you're going to be obedient, you have to follow the laws, and the priests are the ones that determine what the laws are. So after the exile,
Well, they're
priest-
writing them.
yeah, the priestly power is increased. And if you turn up with something that's got a spot or that wasn't brought up the right way, they can just say, no, go away. And how do you make your sacrifice? How do you fulfill it? You know?
Having said that, though, there's still debate that goes on in the Old Testament between kingdoms and between camps of priests.
Oh.
And you still get this in typical Jewish midrashic interpretation that goes backward and forwards in the different books.
Yeah, but
but if you look at it in the big picture, besides the power that ultimately is derived from making sure these laws are kept, it does give a huge sense of identity, doesn't it, to a group of people who are feeling really lost and bewildered, however you want to put it, but it does create an incredible sense of identity for the people.
It does, and it clearly delineates who's in and who's out. Deviation from the community and the common good is just not tolerated in ancient times, because deviation from the law and from what is set out about how you live actually puts the community at risk.
Yes.
So if you start doing stupid things like wanting to go and camp in the desert, unless you're a sort of wild-haired prophet like Elijah, if you do that, you actually put the community at risk in various ways. So it's about keeping you safe and about not tolerating things that make you unsafe.
But you're still, as you say, you're still going to have internally, you're still going to have debates and disagreements. And like the Jews aren't unique in that, because in Christianity, I mean, like one of the clear things in Christianity is that Scripture clearly talks about being baptized. But does that mean baptizing adults or baptizing children? And churches have split over that.
Yeah, that's right.
We've got different denominations with different rules. So that's just interpretation of that law or that ritual.
And of course, when the temple is destroyed in the year 70, everything changes again because the priests are gone. So the law has to be reinterpreted again. And this time it's the Pharisees doing it. So we get various changes as different things happen to the Jewish people throughout their time. So we'll move on to the next bit that we're going to look at, looking at the community of faith. So it's also about how you prosper by conforming to these things. And I've talked about deviation. And so there's goodness and deeds of justice and mercy aren't enough on their own. You've also got to follow the part of the code that makes you whole and complete and perfect. And part of the reason this sort of stuff is in here, every aspect of mundane life is taken into account in the laws. So eating, clothing, your own personal hygiene, how you look after your animals, how you look after your widowed mother, how you look after the aliens and slaves, etc. you might have. Every one of these normal mundane things is seen as a possibility to express the sacred. So to Israelites who have been living in a foreign land, these distinctions are really important. Many assimilated into Babylonian community, we know that, but many did not, and they returned to the homeland. And these laws not only kept themselves separate and distinctive, but reminded them each time they did one of these mundane things, like make their clothes or wash something. These laws were a way of reminding them of who they were and who their God was. So it's important to look at these things not as some burdensome thing that you can't imagine doing yourself, which Christians are wont to do. It's important to look at these things. For an ancient people, this was how you made sure you remembered God and you worshiped God in a foreign land by putting God into everything that you did in your daily life. And if you think of it that way, it should start to make a lot more sense to you why some of these laws are actually there. So the next thing we're going to look about Leviticus, it has a real concern for wholeness and completeness and perfection. So having a look at Leviticus 21, you can see that there's laws there about the priests are making about the temple. So you can't have a blemish. You can't offer food to God that is a sacrifice to God. And it was an ancient belief that the gods ate the smoke of sacrifices, but that again is just a side remark. You can't have a blemish, and you yourself can't be blemished. You can't be blind or lame. You can't have a broken hand. You can't be a dwarf. You can't have some itching disease like scabies or leprosy. You can't have crushed testicles. You have to be perfect, whole and complete, and your animals need to be perfect. So if you have a blemish, they're not going to kill you for it, but you can't come and offer an animal for sacrifice. You can eat the food after it's sacrificed, but you can't approach the altar. So if you have a blemish, and this is talking about the priests. So the priests really have a big burden put on them. If a priest is born with something that is considered by the ancients to be a defective that makes you less than whole, you can't be a priest. You go and join the rabble and they'll feed and look after you, but you can't perform the rites of the temple. So this perfection gets carried into the army. If you have a look at Deuteronomy 23, there's special rules for a military camp. The army can't win a battle without God's blessing and on occasion God's help, as we see when Moses has to hold up his arms high up to defeat, I think it was the Midianites or one of those people. And the camp had to be kept clean and holy like the temple. So in effect, the army camp becomes like the temple with various areas on it. So the same sort of uncleanness that prevents a warrior from entering the camp would also prevent such a person, any person, from entering the sacred places in the temple. So the body has not only got to be unblemished, it's got to be seen to be clean and whole and perfect. So you can notice there in Deuteronomy 23, I bet you've never read these ones before. If you have become unclean because you have a wet dream, then you will go outside the camp and you will not come back into the camp until you have washed yourself with water, and at sundown you can re-enter. If you need to relieve yourself, you need to take your trowel and go outside of the camp where you dig a hole and then you bury your excrement, because the Lord is traveling with you in your camp to save you and to hand your enemies over to you. So the camp has to be holy. So nothing lewd or indecent or grotty can pollute the army. So it's treated as a holy and like a temple area. If we look at Deuteronomy 20, this is an interesting one with the army here, where it points out to you, when you go out to war against your enemies, and note what I said about horses, and see horses and chariots. The enemy always has them. An army larger than your own, you will not be afraid because I am with you. But then there's some rules before you engage as a soldier. So, hear, O Israel, there's that Shema saying again, Shema Israel. Today you are drawing near to a battle, so the official shall say, has anyone built a new house and dedicated it? He shall go back to that, or he might die in battle and not get to do it. Have you planted a vineyard and not picked the fruit? Go back, or you might die in battle and not get to enjoy it. Has anyone become engaged to a woman not married? He should go back to his house, or he might die in battle and not marry her. And the officials go through all this list of things, ending with, is anyone afraid or disheartened? And if you are, go back, or he might cause the heart of your comrades to melt like his own. So this is quite interesting here about the rules for waging a holy war. Now, these aren't necessary pep-up talks to make people feel ashamed of themselves. What they're saying is, unless you are committed, unless everything you have in your being is focused on winning, fighting and winning this battle, go away. If part of your mind and heart is back with your vineyard and your fiance or your house, go back and finish it, because you're not going to pay full attention. This is demanding full attention to what you are doing.
And it's also, this passage is what probably lies behind the words of Jesus about, if you put your hand to the plow and look back, you can't be my disciple. And you know, the parable where he tells people to go back to their home and go back to their wedding and that kind of thing. Rather, yeah.
So this idea of wholeness comes right into the social arena, in the sense that if an important enterprise has been commenced, it should not be left incomplete. So this is where the wholeness aspect comes into it. If you have unfinished business, go and finish it. It should not be left incomplete. So, and as I said, the passage doesn't say this undone business defiles you or makes you a coward. It just means you shouldn't fight if you have unfinished business. You have to be whole in your mind, body, business, soul, heart. Is everything has to be focused on that. I'll just pause there for a minute and ask if people have any questions.
It seems you dismissed the food safety aspects, but all these other rules are also very functional. Like
of course they are.
Like the camp rules, that stems back to maintaining tight discipline. You know, it's not as though it's a boys' weekend. You know, and
I'm not sure that getting rid of your excrement is tight discipline. I really think that's about, you don't allow anything to contaminate the holy area.
I don't know about that. I think that it would be about hygiene. You want to keep the camp. It's, if you've got a lot of people and they're leaving their excrement in the camp, you've got disease.
Got flies and disease.
It would become disgusting if nothing else. It would smell and it would be awful. Yes, I think there's some fundamental health principles underlying why you would go outside and do that. Your nocturnal emission, probably not so. No, I don't think anyone's ever died of a wet dream.
No. And it seems to put them at risk too, because that's when your wild animals are most active.
Well, when you're outside, that's right. So, but we know that nocturnal emissions probably aren't something you can control, but they're obviously considered something that makes you unclean. You've got to go outside, wash yourself, and then wait till sundown to come back into the camp. So there are some health things there, I think, Bruce, but it's not entirely health things. Certainly with the excrement, I would agree with that. With the nocturnal emission, it's just about being clean. And it's all bodily fluids basically in the Old Testament are considered unclean. If it emanates from some orifice in your body, it's unclean, pretty much.
I just meant that it was a very ordered society.
It is very ordered.
If you go back to the 10 Commandments, you know, you could say, well, they're rules that work, you know. So I just thought they were a very ordered, functional society.
They are indeed. And you need to be, because as we've pointed out, these are wilderness or desert dwellers mainly. There's always been risks fighting over scarce resources like fertile ground and water. You are vulnerable to bandits, to wild animals that are around. So staying together and being tight and ordered is really important. And that extends into the military as well. So as you can see, that it goes beyond that.
It seems like it would be a very binding thing to know that those people, those others fighting with you, you're all coming, you're all doing the same thing. You're all on the same page.
You are coming from the same page, and you're all committed to that one particular thing. And that's important. We're going to have a look now at the next thing that Leviticus doesn't like. Leviticus is not keen on hybrids, that is mixing categories of things. And they're all considered forbidden. So mixed categories are forbidden. And you can see if we look at Leviticus 18:23 on page 73.
But that'd be fine. Yeah.
You can see there that you shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself with it, nor shall a woman give herself to an animal because it's a perversion. Now, we might see that as well. That's, yes, well, of course, it's bestiality. You know, we don't do that. You don't mix categories and breeds in Leviticus, and that means human to animal, but it also means animal to animal. So you don't breed horses and donkeys and produce a mule, for instance. That's just an example there. And you can look at Leviticus 19. You will not let your animals breed with a different kind. You will not sow your field with two kinds of seed. You will not put on a garment made of two kinds of fibre.
That's exactly what Mark is.
So it's really looking at what hybrids are and mixed categories are. And I've just put, you shall also not oppress the alien, and you shall not cheat people with your weights, and you shall have honest commerce and trade. Just to remind you that there was all sorts of things in these laws, and that was showing mercy to people and being fair and just was part of it. So mixed categories are not something that is really tolerated in Leviticus. And our translation says perversion. It's not quite accurate. The Hebrew word is tebel, and it means rather to mix or confuse. So you don't confuse species, you don't confuse categories, you don't put two grains together, you don't weave your clothes of wool and cotton or wool and linen or whatever other fibre that you have. So holiness is exemplified by completeness, by conforming to the correct class, and that means you don't confuse the classes or categories of things. So you've got to be whole, you've got to be perfect, and you've got to be in a single category, if that all makes sense in Leviticus. So we're going to come back now to the food laws and look at holiness and the food laws. So which animals are clean? Well, we know from looking at it, it's livestock basically, because they provide meat and they provide milk and they provide hides, and they don't need purification before approaching the temple. They're domesticated. They follow the laws of the people. They observe the Sabbath, for example. And when you look at the story in Jonah, when Jonah tells the king and the people there, they've all got to go into mourning, they also put the animals in sackcloth and ashes as well. And this seems to have been quite common practice. They're under the blessing of God. So cloven-hoofed, cud-chewing ungulates are proper food for pastoralists. So wild beasts, on the other hand, are part of the Noah covenant, but they're not part of the covenant of going into the promised land. They probably attacked stock, they attacked people, they were dirty, they ate your food, like mice and rats, they consumed blood, and therefore they were unclean. And you can look up Leviticus 17 if you want to see what it says about consuming blood. They don't obey the Sabbath law like domestic animals do. And you can look at that in Exodus 20:10 if you are interested in that. The problem is animals that we might not think of as wild or unclean, such as pigs or ducks or shellfish or prawns. Well, I mean, we eat these sorts of things in our life, and that doesn't seem to fit into these classifications neatly. So the pig is unclean for the same reason as the camel is. It's cloven hoof, but it's considered not to chew a cud. So as a pig has no use to any society except for its flesh, and it's not a grazing animal. It's therefore never kept by the Israelites. It's eaten by Greeks and Romans and Babylonians and other cultures around. They have no problem with the pig, but it's not valued as a domestic animal by people who started off as agrarian wanderers who needed milk and hair and flesh from their animals, and the pig's not going to do that. So herding pigs is probably not something that would have occurred to them. Shellfish are forbidden because they live in the sea, because they don't have scales and fins, and that's considered the proper locomotion for a fish. But birds of prey are unclean for the same reasons that wild beasts are. They eat carrion and they eat things that are not bled. So what about water birds? Where do they fit into this, you might ask? Well, Genesis has 3 elements in creation, and you can look at Genesis 1:26 on page 74 to see what they are. And Leviticus has actually developed this and allots the right creature to its proper sphere. So in the air, 2-legged birds, proper 2-legged birds have 2 legs and fly with wings. On the water, proper creatures have scales and fins. On land, proper animals are 4-legged animals that they hop or walk, and 4-footed creatures which fly, that is your other bugs, because they can't count 6, are unclean. Any creature that has 2 legs and 2 hands but goes about on all fours is unclean. So you've got the mouse, the mole, and the crocodile. The translation pause isn't quite accurate. It's actually hands. So it's considered that the mouse is, for instance, is unclean because it creeps on its hands. If it was clean, it would stand up on its feet. And water birds don't fly and should fly and roost in the element of air, not use water because they're birds. What on earth are they doing in water? So they're mixed creatures. Is everyone following what I'm saying here? I'm looking at categories that are considered mixed. So 4-footed creatures that have hands that creep on the ground are you know, they're not doing what you'd expect a clean 4-footed creature to do. You don't expect 4-footed creatures to fly in the air. They should be on the earth. You don't expect birds to be in water because they're meant to roost in trees and fly in the air. So this is where this not mixing classes or categories comes in to define which is clean and unclean. If a creature occupies a number of elements, it's considered unclean. If it doesn't have the proper accoutrements for its element, it's considered unclean. Does everyone understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So eels are in the water, but they don't have fins, so they're unclean. Reptiles live in dry land, but they're not quadrupeds, so they're unclean. Some insects fly, but not as birds, so they're unclean. So it's about mixing classes at this point. So what we have with the dietary laws is what it would have, the dietary laws would have been like signs which at every turn inspired meditation on oneness, purity, and completeness. So that's that wholeness, that being perfect, and that being set apart, and therefore that oneness with God. So the observance of these dietary rules would have been a meaningful part of the great liturgical acts of recognition and worship, which culminated in the sacrifice in the temple. So I'm just going to ask you what you think of that quote.
It's really saying that there's no distinction between the special religious thing that you do at the temple and the ordinary daily thing that you do at home.
Yes.
That they're all part of the same package and they all have the same reason for being.
Which allowed the Pharisees to actually take over the instruction of religion when the second temple was destroyed, because you've got these 2 parts. You've got holiness in your life, in your ordinary life, and you have holiness in the temple. So basically, foods are based on being clean or unclean, and things are based on being clean or unclean, depending on how they fit these categories of wholeness and purity or perfection, and whether or not they're in their expected category, so not mixed. Does everyone understand how we've got to this point with Levitical laws? So that's how things are judged clean or unclean. If
To
it's
what
mixed categories, it's unclean. If it's not doing what it's meant to do as a pastoral thing, it's unclean in its particular sphere, whether that's earth, water, or sea. Now, the only exception to that is the locust, because it flies and you're allowed to eat it. And the only reason I can think of that the locust is an exception is that in years when your crops were destroyed by the locust, the only food you had was the locust. And that's why they ate them. So it's been included in clean. It talks about how it hops and how its knee bends and some other stuff there about what makes it clean. But it's probably been a very practical thing that's put it in, like the herd animals. It's been put into a clean category because in those years it's food when everything else goes.
Because it eats your food.
Yeah.
I think it's partly that the locusts, in fact, at some stages in their life cycle, in fact, do creep along the ground when they're busy eating up your food, that they move on the ground and they don't fly. And it's only when they've run out of food that they start to fly.
I suspect that's when they really probably get caught and eaten. They may eat them when they creep. I don't know the answer to that, because I think that it does say that the clean food laws do suggest that it is when they fly is when they're allowed to eat them. So I'm guessing when they swarm is when they eat them. And by then they're probably starving anyway. So Leviticus is presenting us, this is a nice quote we have here. So the Holiness Code functions to establish Israel as a holy entity, as a community different to the communities around it. It's attained by creation and maintenance of certain structures in time. So we have festivals and sabbatical calendars. We have the temple and its courtyards. We have your own personal status. So you observe the sexual taboos, etc. You practice justice and charity. We have your everyday life, which is food and bathing and clothing. And these regulations have social benefits are really quite clear. But it isn't just that. They're important because they're divinely ordained, not because they serve utilitarian purposes. That is a secondary thing if it's there at all. It's because they're divinely ordained and they make you holy and they set you apart. And this is a good quote, I think, to sum it up. Leviticus presents us with a unique and detailed view into the mental world of a particular segment of biblical society. It speaks out of an institutional setting that is very foreign to us, but the larger themes that Leviticus is working out through its minute how-to instructions are universal religious themes. Leviticus tells us how to be holy, not in emotion, intention, or religious feeling, but in the details of everyday life. Leviticus suggests that everything we do can have a sacred quality if we pay attention to the details and perform each act properly. Any comments about that quote?
So you can do the washing up for God.
Yes, correct.
Mm.
You can meditate on making your dishes pure because, of course, the Jews washed their stuff. That was part of making them clean.
Mm. It sort of brings in that individual relationship to God, because I guess in the past they're looking at the Old Testament as the people just look to the priests, but this makes it look a bit different then.
Yes, so you had your own tasks that you paid attention to make yourself holy, as well as what the priest may require of you in the temple. But it's also communal.
Yeah.
Most of these, there's so many of these laws are communal about how to look after the less fortunate, about how to do things for the benefit and the good of the people. Because if you weren't a community, you're vulnerable. So it's not just about your relationship with God, it's about how your relationship with God then impacts on the community.
And it's how a whole community is worshipping God. So everybody does it. It's not just an individual choice.
Good point. It's a must, yeah.
It is a must. And everyone is doing it. And it keeps you safe. It preserves what preserves you.
Mm. I think that's the thing we probably find the hardest in our Christian context. Most of how we live out our Christianity is from an individual perspective, whereas this is a whole community living the same way with the same intent.
That's right. And you all go to the temple or the tabernacle at the right times for the festivals, whether that's Pentecost or booths or tabernacles, or whether it's Passover. You have the same ritual, the same liturgy, you're doing the same sacrifice, you're lighting the same candles and saying the same blessings and prayers over them. And you're doing it at the same time. So there's this vast communal aspect of coming together. It's like Hebrews when it talks about, in the letter of Hebrews, when it talks about that cloud of witnesses all around you, all doing the same things that you're doing. So it's communal as well as individual in its intent. But the individual can't be isolated from the community, if that makes sense.
Well, one of the punishments is isolation from the community, I know.
Exactly. Well spotted, Peter. That is the worst thing that can happen to you in ancient times, to be sent into purgatory outside in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And your chances of survival, if you're out there for any time, are pretty low.
And that's where we struggle with this, because individuality is something in our society that's prized. So it is so foreign to our way of thinking, and yet it's still what binds the Jewish people together today.
I think it's probably what's caused the Jewish people to keep existing despite the wholesale efforts of people through several millennia to completely destroy them, including in the last century with the Holocaust.
Yes.
They have managed to hang on to their faith, which is an extraordinary thing in the light of some of the events that have happened to them, and to stay focused as a people and bound by these laws and by these practices and by their identity as the Jewish community. And they couldn't do that as individuals. That would have been impossible.
Yeah.
We're not good as Christians at honouring the sacred in our ordinary lives. The closest we would probably get is saying grace over our meals. I can't think of a single Christian ritual that we all do routinely in our ordinary lives other than the act of maybe saying grace or maybe saying a prayer. We just don't have them. We lost them. When Judaism became Christianity, we lost a lot of this stuff. It gradually worked its way out. And it became very individualistic based on the letters of Paul, which is quite a misunderstanding of what Paul was saying, I'm thinking. Because I'm not sure he is advocating an individual Christianity separate from the community, but it's read that way.
But we did used to have them. At school, we had the matins, the midday bell, and we'd say a prayer, and there was the morning. So it was there during the church's history, but it's just sort of disappeared.
It's a very Protestant thing to have gotten rid of all of those kinds of things, at least within the Catholic tradition. Like there's the rosary, and there are in the monastic tradition there are the different hours of the day.
You do.
And some of those things survive but they become religious acts, not ordinary acts. They're still part of day, but
they're not a way of life anymore.
No, it's not.
That's a good way of putting it.
It is a good way of putting it.
Your food, and when you get dressed, and when you clean yourself, and when you clean your utensils, that's everyday life, and all of those are religious acts in this scheme.
Okay.
Striking.
Yes. And we don't have those, as I said, we don't have those community ways of coming together. We tend to think of ourselves as a bunch of individuals that go to a congregation on Sunday, and we might do things that we volunteer for during the week, like work in an op shop or a soup kitchen or something like that. But we actually don't practice rituals during the week in the consideration of ourselves as a Christian collective.
No.
We don't have the togetherness all the time like they used to.
No. But even though they were separate, they were together.
Unfortunately, we've sort of been overridden by a much wider cultural view of individualism as opposed to community living.
And we don't work together as a community to actually consciously name aims and goals that we're going to work for to be a better person. The law actually gives you that.
Yeah.
The law says things like you shall not do these certain things, or you will consider these certain things, and you will have a society established on these principles, and this is how you're going to get them. Leviticus spells all of that out. We never get together as a Christian community, or rarely get together as a Christian community and say, all right, how do we become better disciples? How do we become more faithful people? What are the things that we could actually actively together put into practice that might change us and the society around us? That is what Leviticus and the other laws in Exodus and Deuteronomy set out to do. We actually don't have that as a religious faith. Even the Muslims do better than us on these things, where they've actually got prescribed things they're meant to do on a weekly or daily basis to help improve themselves as a faithful adherent to the faith and to follow what Allah's commands are. We just don't have this in the Western world. They may have in other cultures, but not ours.
Isn't the cost of that conformity? And I think that can be a high cost for people who don't fit.
Well, that's part of the world, the way we think in the world today. That's individualism. And that's why we've lost the notion of community.
Yeah, but I don't think we want to be too romantic about it. It excluded a lot of people. A lot of people were ostracised, and they were forced to do things that.
Well, I mean, one of the
so
clearest.
It's a cost for some people.
Yeah, one of the clearest examples about that, not to introduce the controversial topic right at the end when we're over time, but one of the clearest examples about that is it's in Leviticus, in these laws, that we get those two very clear prescriptions about homosexual relations, as we call it.
Yes,
because that's a mixing of categories. Male belongs with female. Male doesn't belong with male. And that's
it's a non-mixing of categories, actually.
Well,
anyway.
Well, it is and it isn't, because you've got to
in terms of
consider
sexual relationships, you're supposed to do that.
It's about procreation, actually. If you go back to Genesis, it's about
procreation.
procreation.
It's not about relationships.
No, it's not about relationships. It's about that. And one thing I'd want to point out to you, Kate, is that there's a difference between community and a cult. There's a difference between being a sect and a community.
Yes.
A community should not be about conformity. A community should be about working together to better yourselves and your society. A cult is about conforming, and that's quite a different thing. And I would agree with you on that. But this isn't what Leviticus is about. It has cultic elements. The required ritual sacrifices are often referred to as cultic elements. But in our society, we're not saying you have to be the same and conform and be in a fundamentalist sect that lists out all these rooms that you follow or you're ostracised or punished. What I'm saying is we don't actually work together as a community to better ourselves and our communities in an intentional and conscious way.
Yeah.
And that's what Leviticus is meant to set out. And a lot of our laws from welfare come from Leviticus. We didn't have to, I picked the food laws because we all know about them. But if you read through Leviticus, you'll find there's heaps of laws about looking after the poor and how they're to be treated and where they are to be fed, et cetera, et cetera. Most of us don't realise the sacrifices at the temple were part of the welfare system. When you sacrificed an animal, you kept some and took it home for dinner. The priests kept some for their dinner because that's how they were paid. And then the rest of it was set aside for those who had no money. And they can come to the temple and that was given to them. And then you have rules about gleaning, so they can go to fields and they can gather grain and they can gather fallen things on the side. There's all sorts of things to do with the good, the common good. So the community is looked after and no one starves and no one's, maltreated. And that's what the whole idea is when we talk about that. So did you find Leviticus interesting?
Yes.
Yes.
I told you so.
Surprisingly.
You see, I told you would. I suggest now that you all put on your social scientific lenses and go read some more of it and see what you can discover in this very forgotten, overlooked book.